In Henry IV, Part 1, there's a wonderful moment of hubris and bravado where Shakespeare has one of the characters, Owen Glendower, the Welsh nobleman, say to his young cousin Hotspur, "I can call spirits from the Vasty Deep." Hotspur responds, "Why, so can I, and so can any man, but will they come when you do call for them?" "I can call, and will they come?" sets a frame for looking at one of the most significant events of our time, the global financial crisis, which is reshaping the contours and fault lines of social, political, and economic life in ways that will be felt for many years. Before the crisis, in my daily work, we faced legions of Glendowers claiming to be doing extraordinary things. Things like effectively managing risk, consistently outperforming, beating the markets, doing what in finance speak is called generating alpha. After the crisis, these claims seemed to evaporate. No one was responsible for poor performance. Don't you understand? The global financial crisis is a once in several lifetimes event. It's 6 sigmas of standard deviation, the ultimate outlier. Our risk systems failed. It brought to mind this famous expression used multiple times in history when things go horribly wrong, including by JFK at the Bay of Pigs, that victory has 1,000 fathers, yet defeat is an orphan. So what do the Vasty Deep, Hotspur, Glendower, Shakespeare have to do with the financial crisis? Actually, a lot. Firstly, they help us think about the problem of agency. Will the spirits really come when you call for them? Or do they somehow have a will of their own? Let me introduce you to a very illustrious character, Raven Thorogood III. This was a 5-year-old chimp who threw darts at 133 internet companies in 1999, made 213%, outperforming indices, peers, professional money managers, and best of all, Raven charged no performance nor management fees. So the takeaway here is that for binary activities like trading or coin tosses, you have a 50% probability of being right. And often random occurrences can consistently, until they suddenly turn, seem to signal success, that there's intentional causal agency behind them. It's as if the spirits appeared to materialize and Glendower would claim to have control over them, but as Raven Thorogood thoroughly knows, the spirits are actually just having a good time, doing their own thing in arbitrary and capricious ways as spirits are wont to do. So nevertheless, it's often quite difficult to distinguish between dumb luck and skilled intentional activity, where there's genuine capacity to perform. The internet bubble, where Raven Thorogood had swag, is a precursor of the credit super bubble, which is at the root of the GFC. It's given us a whole new vocabulary with terms like mortgage-backed securities, black swans, credit default swaps, too big to fail, the new normal. And at its core, it makes us think about the whole problem of agency. So on one hand, we have an idea of agency as very robust causal intentional activity. And on the other, there's exogeneity, these uncontrollable factors that are beyond the nature of agents to control. In fact, we can think about agency and exogeneity as 2 pillars at the portals of human experience. Various disciplines try to calibrate the relationship between them and really understand their proper relationship. For example, think of debates about free will versus determinism, or nurture versus nature, or the efficacy or agency of a drug versus the exogenous placebo effect. There's arguments that have taken place all through religious discourse about salvation by deeds or good works versus grace or Calvinist predestination. And then in markets, there's the problem of whether markets are agent-centric, and reflexive or tending towards inefficiency, or is there some sort of spirit of the market, an invisible hand which guides and controls and ultimately yields aggregate efficiency? Of course, sometimes it's best to find a middle ground, some theory about complementarity, like in neuroscience, where the theory of lateralism explains the complex relationship between the left and right brain and how they work together to round out cognition. Back to the Vasty Deep. So on one hand, we have this idea of robust agency, and on the other, exogeneity. Before the crisis, we had the pendulum swinging far into Glendowan territory. So risks, it seemed, had been tamed by causal agency. Sophisticated risk management systems, diversification, active hedging, the Gaussian copula formula, over-collateralized tranches of structured debt, you name it. In fact, noble risks and unknoble uncertainties were treated synonymously, as if they were interchangeable. Various terms came to describe this golden age, including Goldilocks, an era where economic forces had been engineered to be not too hot or too cold, but just right. So all of us could heartily eat of this wholesome porridge. The Glendowan folks at the helm of the global economy, traders, central bankers, politicians, and so forth, assured us that any moments of bad weather were just temporary blips. Seas will come. We sail on riskless AAA vessels. We mostly call and control the spirits, and the spirits are kind. There's nothing to fear. Well, as we all know, towards the end of 2007 and continuing to the present day, things went horribly wrong. The once benign Vasty Deep turned nasty. And the real problem of the Vasty Deep began to reveal itself. Here's how. Economic agents in financial markets take risks through speculative activity and seek to be compensated for those risks. Properly understood, risks can be assumed, managed, mitigated by responsible causal agency. Agency gone awry caused the crisis. At first blush, it seems that the locus of the crisis, the asset class which began it, is housing, but it's actually all about credit. At its core, credit is a promise to pay, an act of faith predicated on the assumption that there's some ability to deliver, to make good on that promise at some time in the future. Credit obligations are actually assets of credit holders, and they can take those obligations and get further credit based on them. So credit has a kind of multiplier effect. Credit is the lifeblood of healthy economies. It empowers people. It gives them access to capital and resources otherwise unavailable. But as it multiplies and builds up, it can turn toxic. It ceases to be an oxygenating force. Credit caused the crisis as it bloated to a super bubble and then cast agency into the Vasty Deep of exogeneity. What do we mean by this? Ultimately, agents made promises, future promises to pay, but those promises were dependent upon exogenous factors. Factors like artificial inflation of asset prices, creditors amending and extending the terms of loans, governments bailing out excessive indebtedness. Decoupled from capacity to perform, promises about the future, reduced to exogeneity, caused agents to cast the entire economic system into the Vasty Deep. Put in human or moral terms, this is disingenuous agency run amok. Think Hotspur, Glendower, and indeed the whole cast of characters in the play making promises about the future with no capacity to perform and no Shakespeare to rein them in. It seems that credit cycles inevitably spiral into this state of affairs. In the US economy alone, there's $50 trillion of stretched out future obligations to pay. And these problems are ultimately exacerbated by two things: central bankers who extend cheap credit, artificially inflating asset prices, and then when bubbles burst, they have to continue this credit to prop the system up, and the herding effect, which exacerbates these boom-bust cycles. The end point, wholesale insolvency, the sinking of most ships. Ancient societies have various terms for what happens next, including the word jubilee, where debts get wiped out and we hit the system reset button. Another interesting insight from the crisis is properly understanding risk, not as a static phenomenon, but as something more dynamic. Individual risks can aggregate. One kind of risk can morph into another. For instance, winds picking up can turn to a hole in the hull. Individual risks, idiosyncratic risks, can also become contagions. And then systematic risk always stays on the horizon of the Vasty Deep. Professionals in various disciplines understand this, including physicians who know how systemic risks can take down the whole organism in biology. But somehow this basic truth was lost on our Glendower helmsman. So the aftermath of the crisis is an extended period of deleveraging. This means unwinding bad promises by incapacitated agents. John Maynard Keynes famously talked about animal spirits, those spontaneous urges to action, spending, and risk-taking by which the wheels of an economy turn. But the efforts of policymakers to ignite these animal spirits is necessarily going to face up against this exogenous headwind of deleveraging. So our dialogue ends dramatically with Glendower telling Hotspur that he can teach him to command the devil. Hotspur responds, "Why, I can teach thee, cause, to shame the devil by telling the truth." Yes. Truth-telling is the vessel that contains these spirits of instability, uncertainty, economic collapse that we allowed to become unleashed. Truth means recovering a proper relationship between agency and capacity to perform. Absent the ability to make good on future promises, we perhaps shouldn't be making these promises in the first place. We need to recover an appropriate definition of economic agency. Truth means we need to understand that this global financial crisis, this vasty deep mess in which we find ourselves, was decades in the making and is going to take years to unwind. It means we mustn't trust quick fixes, raise or cut taxes, shrink government, spend our way to prosperity. And it means that we need to recover truer definitions of credit, creditworthiness, and credibility. And then we will have more trusty, seaworthy vessels. Finally, truth requires that we never forget the essential truth about exogeneity, those risks and uncertainties about which no real promises can be made and over which no genuine agency prevails.